Hello.
Hi, can you see and hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Cool, cool. Hi, it's good to see you.
Good to see you as well. It's your first guest who's been on Niche Conversations twice. So that's exciting.
Wow. Oh, that is cool. I didn't know that. That's really
Yeah.
neat. Oh, well, it's good
So
to see you. I'm really excited. We have
yeah.
perfect weather for it today. New England kind of put on
Yes.
its spookiest, darkest, stormiest night that it could muster in the daytime.
Awesome. It's very gloomy here as well. And it rained all night. So yeah. So I'm
That's
Jessica DeWitt.
perfect.
I'm one of the editors for Network in Canadian History and Environment. And today I'm joined by Caroline Evans Abbott. Do you want to tell us more about yourself?
Sure, I'm not that exciting, but I'm a recent graduate of Glasgow University. I have an MRes in English literature, but I kind of graduated towards the environmental humanities more and more after graduation. And I guess I would class myself as an independent scholar at the moment. And I've worked with NiCHE a couple times now, which has been a lot of fun. Um, yeah, I'm currently back in Connecticut for the first time in a long time, which is really neat and also kind of exciting and fits quite well with this story, so very appropriate.
Awesome. So I invited you here today because back in June you wrote a piece for my Parks and Profit series, which looked at just various ways that profit is associated with parks. And you wrote a piece called The Trouble on Hell Hollow Road, White Ghosts, Maternal Grief, and the Gendered Fragility of American Park Mythology. And while it was great in June, I think the topic is even better now in late October.
Yeah, it definitely fits. I
um,
was so hoping
yeah.
that I'd get to do something with it someday for Halloween because this story stuck with me for years, so I'm very, very
Yeah.
happy and grateful.
So let's start with what this story is. What
All
is the
right.
story of the Ghost of Maud, and what
Okay.
is your personal connection to it?
I wish I had a fog machine or spookier lighting, but so this is one of those stories that's very much a two-sided coin. You have well, it's more than that, of course, but the fabled story revolves around the ghost of a witch named Maud, who occupies Hell Hollow in Patchogue State Forest. Hell Hollow is now a pond area, predominantly also the surrounding woods, and the park road itself is called Hell Hollow Road. And the story goes that this witch was so evil that when she died, her family said, no, you're not getting buried with us. That's not good for the afterlife. Get out. And they buried her somewhere else. And as a result,
Mm.
she haunts the park road seeking her vengeance. So it's sort of a rite of passage among predominantly bored teenagers in northeastern Connecticut to belt down that road as fast as you can on Halloween or, generally whenever you're feeling spooky, and keep an eye out for the ghost of Maud. You hear these stories all over the region. It's very much a part of the youth culture and also the adult culture because this story's been around since the 1890s. It sort of picked up the pace after the Blair Witch Project, I would expect, in the
Yeah.
1990s. But so the real story is, I think, much more interesting. Maud really did exist. And the way history has treated her story is really fascinating. She was actually a toddler. There's some debate on the exact year that she passed away. So she was either 2 or 3 when she died. She did live in Hell Hollow with her parents, Lucy and Gilbert Reynolds. At the time of the 1880 census, they had a single horse farm, which kind of illustrates the very rural, small community that they were working with at the time. And the real story goes, which has also been mythologized to its own extent, but that story goes that she was very sick, and in the middle of the night, she was hungry, so she woke up and she took a bite of an apple, and unfortunately, she choked on it, and she passed over the night, and her parents presumably found her in the morning. Now, it's widely believed that Maud actually had diphtheria, which causes massive swelling of the throat, especially in children, and forms a notorious kind of leather patch, a membrane on the back of the throat, which can make it very hard to swallow. Diphtheria was rampant in New England in I think the first part of the 18th century, right around 1730. So
Mm.
it was still endemic to the region at that time, and the vaccine wouldn't be developed to any standard until a few decades later at the least. So anyway, to get to the burial story, she was interred much closer to the house because the story goes, her parents wanted to be much closer to her. They wanted to keep an eye on her. And specifically, the story goes that her mother, Lucy, made this choice. But they already had a family plot. It's just that it was much farther down the property where they couldn't see the little girl. And the mother wanted to look out on the baby girl in her resting place and be able to see her from the house. So that is the common story of the ghost. That is the story of the actual little girl and her family. And as you can see, the stories are extremely different, and completely bizarre in that, you know, we're taught to believe in the ghost story that this was an adult woman who was drawn to witchcraft and sucked into evil, and the reality is just extremely different.
Yeah, it's fascinating how our stories of things and the reality is just completely, they take on different lives, right? Like they're
Yeah.
totally different things. No, it's very fascinating. And what you talk about in the article, in the essay, a lot, you talk about gender a lot. So I thought that we moved the conversation into talking about what Maud and other stories of white women ghosts kind of tell us about our conceptions of gender.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Honestly, I think the reason that this stuck with me for such a long time is that it was a very frustrating story
Yeah.
at some level, because you hear it and, you know, it's a ghost story. You know it doesn't line up. You know it's not sitting well with you. You don't really know why. And when you look into it, you start to see this truth and the reality, and then I started to notice a little bit of a pattern. A lot of the ghost stories that are mythologized in North America pertain to this one archetype. You often see, at least in the notable examples that I think I referenced in the essay and that I can think of now, is this female, white, obviously cisgendered, obviously usually heterosexual ghost. And when you look at San Francisco, there's the Lady of Stowe Lake who runs around in a white dress looking for her drowned baby. You see the Leeds baby, or the Jersey Devil in New Jersey, which is the damned offspring of a woman who made a deal with the devil to have a 13th child. The connection to this white archetype and the feminine, and specifically as it hinges upon this reproductive aspect, when that occurs, is very interesting when you pair it with park mythology, which is your theory, which got me so excited to pair this in, where we see parks as unqualified good things. Well, I think we can also consider these stories to be unqualified good things, because we hear them every year. They're a huge part of the culture, especially in New England. So much of our tourism is centered around autumn and people coming in. Salem is a huge tourist attraction. So seeing that and considering these stories for their presence on public land, you also start to see how those stories themselves become sort of a verbal commodity, which considers them as a non-monetary form of profit and exchange. When you have people trading this dialogue about these women who have themselves shaped environment. Lucy's non-normative choice was the reason this whole thing started, if we can attribute it to the mother in the first place and not both parents, which is a whole nother conversation. So the underpinning is, I guess, that this is impossible to look at without looking at gender and the way that gender and sexuality play into the development of folklore, and how that folklore starts to impact our mythology of public land. Hell Hollow itself, I should also say, is on Mohegan land. And it's just such a critical thing to understand our relationship with those spaces, I think.
Yeah, I love the idea of social credit that you bring up, how, and that's something I wanted to explore with the series, is that profit doesn't have to be money. Like, the profit comes in other ways, in other forms, and I think that's still very underexplored when it comes to parks, or even any topic, actually.
Yeah.
And it also gets me thinking about, like, the ghost stories that really sat with me when I was a youth. And, I was thinking, it's like, yeah, they're mainly women. I was thinking the one when I was at college, we used a Ouija board to
Oh.
contact her. that's
I
another
still haven't been
story.
brave
But
enough, so you're braver than I am.
that's a whole
I've
nother
never been
story.
invited, but I've never done it. Someday
I
you'll
did
have
it
to
a
come and
lot
go.
in college. But like there was a sex worker ghost who was hit by a
Oh,
train
I've heard of a couple of those.
who
Yep.
walked the train tracks at night. So that was like a major one in college that I can think of, and that we tried to contact, and they have. We'll see. That's
You
another
know, and
story.
that really pulls into the prophet aspect too, especially in, I
Mm-hmm.
think, femme and queer circles. These exchanges, I think, with the spiritual also emerge as being a form of engagement with each other and with the
Mm-hmm.
world and the parks that we end up shaping. So that is so
Yeah.
fascinating. The sex worker thing, now that I'm thinking of that, is a whole another faction specifically
Yeah.
of ghost stories. So my head's alive with
Yeah.
ideas.
It's like that archetype of what a woman should do in her life if that's interrupted in some way or she's chosen something that's not
Yeah.
um, doesn't align with what she's supposed to be doing, or if that's interrupted by a tragedy or something, then that's something that we really feed into. That's what I'm thinking through right now.
Absolutely. I
Um,
mean, I kept imagining when I would hear this and whenever it came up, because it comes up once a year, how these stories, I mean, I'm sure that little kids are hearing them. I know they are. I was one of
yeah.
them. I know that that's going to shape their ideas of what happens. I mean, I was thinking if we were to reduce the story of Lucy and Maud to like a reductress or a satirical article title, it would be "White Woman Makes Non-Normative Choice, is a Witch, Shocking," and
Yeah.
it's very
Yeah.
consistent.
Yeah. That's fascinating. So we're talking about gender here. And in the essay, you connect that to race and the environment. So I thought we'd finish up by, what do these stories, what is Maud's story? What do other stories of white ghosts tell us about our ideas of race and the
Yeah,
environment and how they're connected?
that's a big, big topic.
It's a very big topic.
This is one I could spend, I think, the most time talking about, so I'll try to rein myself in.
Yeah.
Um, I have an author that I frequently quote, and I should probably diversify myself, but I just love him. His name is John T. Coleman, and he spoke in his book Vicious about the ways that folklore and environmental history and history are very connected. And he kind of hinted that more work needs to be done there. I think that folklore is frequently undervalued as a primary source in academia
Yeah.
because it's really hard to quantifiably put into a paper source. You can have an audio one, but there's a lot of bias. So to move that to a conversation of race, it does bring in the intersectionality aspect quite a bit. Academic intersectionality is a huge topic today as we pull in conversations about critical race theory as well. I believe it was the same academic who coined both of those. I could be wrong about that, but when I look at these ghosts and we look at their archetype, I think it's impossible to consider this without thinking about white fragility, specifically since it is often a female cisgendered woman, and specifically because it ties into the reproductive, not infrequently either through sex work or pregnancy or relationships, which would then lead to or not lead to fruitful bearing. You have this fragility in that it is dependent upon these white women. It is not going to grow beyond that. It is always going to be the same thing. That puts a very clear gendered and racial barrier around these environments because not only are these ghosts shaping those environments today, I mean, the story of Lucy and Maud, the other aspect to it that makes it such a popular narrative is because people would go and defile the child's grave, which does exist on site at Hell Hollow to the point where they had to move it. You look at the way this archetype is changing physical public lands and the way that these real people, in the case of Lucy and Gilbert and Maud, they did change the land. So you have white actors on environment who are being commodified by culture, and they're changing the way that we engage with environment, and in some ways they're keeping it the same. These are people we can put a name to, we can look through the records. That's a huge amount of privilege. You can't do that for the populations of Indigenous and First Peoples who were living in these communities and who were pushed out by colonization. So especially when we're looking at conversations about park prophet mythologizing these characters and others, you have to consider that the presence of these ghosts, they kind of do continue to be colonists of the space, especially culturally. So I don't think that that's everything I could say about it. But recently, with the conversations specifically that are going on about residential schools, and with conversations, I think this has probably made it up to you guys, but there was the recent murder of Gabby Petito in Wyoming, yes, which has made international headlines all over the world. I think they've found like between 5 and 9 bodies from missing persons in the search for her fiance who is on the run. These are the people who become mythologized. We're witnessing it happen there. And when we turn to the residential schools, you really start to see who ends up being a story and who ends up being valorized and who ends up being sort of just passed over, or we shrug our shoulders and say, how sad. So I don't think it's possible to talk about death in environment at this stage in the world without considering critical race theory and without considering how that mythology is dependent upon gender. Curiarchy plays into that, which I could talk about for a long time too. But uniting these systems of global dominance, like Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza did, it gives us a lens through which to view the connection of all of these things. And I think that was what was so fascinating to me about this, in part.
Disco Kitty says 100. Agrees
I didn't quite catch that, sorry.
Disco Kitty is in the comments, says 100.
Oh, hi. Hey, she's so sweet.
Yeah, I like this idea of how stories are a way of claiming ownership to a space, and also claiming like deep ownership to it, right?
Yeah.
Like this ghost goes back generations,
long time.
right?
Yeah,
A long
1890,
time.
gosh, over 100 years ago, which is hard to believe as a 90s baby, but
and I feel like ghosts always seem older than they are.
yes.
Like 1890 isn't that long ago, but
no, not really.
But when you think about, like when you're a child or like a young person, you're thinking about these ghosts, it seems like it's really old, and like these people have been here forever. And it is a way of erasing what was before that, right? And it's just a really interesting mind exercise, and
it's a lot of fun to look at.
Yeah.
And terrifying in its own right, in more ways than one, I guess, depending on how you want to look at it. But it's a really diverse thing to pick apart in 1,000 different ways. And like you said, everybody thinks that these ghosts have been here forever. I think the saying in Britain is that in Britain, 300 miles is a long way, and in America, and I think probably also Canada as well, 300 years is a long time. And it's very different, but we all, I think, in Northern American imperial and post-colonial systems, I suppose I couldn't really call us post-colonial at this point, but that's my personal opinion. Anyway, I think that we see a lot of mythologizing of the 19th century, specifically the late 19th century. And it continues to be pervasive. That was a time of a lot of environmental nationalism. So whenever these stories emerge, it really does get you thinking about how much those are the ghosts that are still present. They're all around us. Anywhere you go in a public park, there's at least one creeping around somewhere.
I grew up outside of Cook Forest State Park, and there's the Cook Cemetery on the hill right by the park, and there were tons of ghosts in that. And I remember going there with a medium with my mom. I was very young, and we took like Polaroids, and the medium like said that like the the white lights. Of course, there's a garbage truck out there. The white lights are were ghosts in the pictures. Of course, it terrified me because I was like 6. I don't even know why my mom brought me, but that's just that's a park that had this cemetery next to it, and it's very, very interesting.
Is
Yeah.
that is really cool, and that sounds like a really fun trip. It must have been terrifying, but that does sound really cool.
Yeah, my
Very
mom
cool.
was super into ghosts, and she got a kick out of the fact that I was not. So, but
Yeah, I
it's
can think
memorable
of.
though.
Yeah, it definitely is. My dad and I used to visit. We'd go on walks all the time around in New England, and there are so many memories of times we'd be walking and we'd find these old family plots in the middle of the woods because, of course, New
Mm,
England, as we know it in the forested regions, apart from a few corners, are mostly new growth because this was predominantly farmland,
yeah.
which is how you end up with the haunted woods. They really aren't that old. They've just kind of grown around these graves because this is a product of how we've shaped environment. So it is
Mhm.
very fascinating to think about what we think of as being old in those contexts. And yeah.
Mhm. Cool. Well, I want to thank you for joining me, and this was
Thank you
really
so much
lovely.
for having me. This was very
Um,
much in the spirit of the season. I can't thank you enough for the opportunity to talk about this a little and hopefully bring some spirit to people in one way or another.
yes, yes, and I encourage everyone to check out The Trouble on Hell Hollow Road because it's really good, and I loved it. So,
And please check out the other essays in this series as well as Jessica's because that was, I mean, this piece was so exciting to me because I carried this story for years. It didn't fit anywhere, and then you guys kind of
mhm.
found me, and it told me a lot about my own work. So check out Jessica's theory of park mythology because it's brilliant and
Oh,
wonderful
thank
and
you.
important.
Thank you, Boston or Be Austin in the comments. I'm
Oh,
glad you
hi,
loved
Brittany. I'm
it.
glad you're here.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks,
Thanks, Dee.
Caroline.
Thank you,
Talk soon.
guys. Bye.
Bye.